The Galactic Council Chamber was the largest gathering place in known space, and today. It held representatives from every species that mattered in the galaxy. Ambassador Vexter of the Krell Dominion stood at the center platform, and his voice carried through the translators to every corner of the massive hall. He was speaking about humans, and none of his words were kind. Jake Morrison sat in the human delegation booth and tried to keep his expression neutral. The commander had been a diplomat for 12 years, and he had faced difficult negotiations before, but nothing like this. Beside him sat Lisa Hamilton, and the doctor was reviewing data on her tablet with growing concern. The numbers did not look good, and the votes were already being tallied before the debate had even properly begun.
Baxter
Was explaining to the assembly why humans were a problem. They expanded too fast and asked too many questions, and refused to accept the way things had always been done. Humans had only been part of the galactic community for 2 centuries, but they had already spread across 3 sectors and established colonies on dozens of worlds. They developed new technologies without permission, and they treated their artificial intelligence programs as equals instead of tools. They modified their own genetics and explored dangerous phenomena that the elder species had declared off-limits for good reasons. The Valorian representative spoke next, and it was a being of pure energy contained in a crystal shell. The translation software converted its frequency patterns into words that everyone could understand. The Valorians agreed with the Krell, and they said that humans disrupted the natural balance of galactic society. Humans questioned traditions that had stood for 10,000 years, and they showed no respect for the wisdom of species that had been traveling the stars since before Earth even had multicellular life. One by one, the other species voiced their concerns. The humans were too ambitious and too reckless and too willing to ignore rules that existed for important purposes. They shared their technology too freely with younger species, and they encouraged others to question the established order. They were dangerous not because they were evil, but because they refused to accept their place as a junior species that should be learning from their elders instead of trying to teach everyone. Else Jake knew that the decision had already been made before any of them had even arrived at the council chambers. This was not a debate, and it was not a trial. This was a sentencing, and humans were about to be expelled from the only galactic community that existed. The vote came, and it was not even close. 47 species voted to expel humanity from council space. Only 3 voted against the measure, and 2 abstained. The numbers told the whole story, and that story was that humans were not wanted here. Vexter read the terms of expulsion with the formal tone of someone performing an unpleasant but necessary duty. Humanity had 1 standard galactic year to withdraw all citizens and all vessels from every territory. Beyond their home solar system, any human ship found in council space after the deadline would be destroyed without warning and without negotiation. All trade agreements were terminated immediately, and all diplomatic relationships were severed. Earth was to become an isolated world, and humanity was to stay there until they learned to be civilized by galactic standards. Jake stood when the verdict was finished. His voice was steady, but everyone in the chamber could hear the anger underneath the calm surface. He told them they were making a mistake, and he reminded them of everything humanity had contributed in just 2 centuries. Humans had made more scientific discoveries than most species achieved in millennia, and they had shared every single breakthrough freely with anyone who wanted it. They had helped solve problems and stopped conflicts and saved lives without asking for anything in return except acceptance. Counselor Thrain of the Assembled Worlds responded, and his words were cold. He said that was exactly the problem, because humans shared too much and disrupted too easily and refused to understand that some things were meant to remain mysteries. The galaxy had been stable and peaceful for thousands of years before humans arrived. It would be stable and peaceful again once they were gone. The walk back to their shuttle felt longer than it should have. Lisa was quiet for most of the journey, but finally she asked the question that was on both their minds. What were they supposed to tell everyone back home, and how were they supposed to explain that humanity had just been kicked out of the galaxy, Jake looked out at the massive space station that had been humanity's gateway to the stars for nearly 100 years. Ships from dozens of species docked there and traded goods and exchanged ideas and built relationships that spanned light years. Soon, there would be no human ships at those docks and no human voices in those conversations. He told Lisa that they would tell Earth the truth. They would explain that the galaxy had just declared war on everything that made humanity unique. The journey back to Earth took 3 weeks, and during that time, the emergency sessions of the unified Earth government debated every possible response. Some wanted to fight, and some wanted to negotiate. And some wanted to simply comply and hope that eventually the council would change its mind. In the end, the pragmatists won because the numbers were clear. Humanity had millions of citizens spread across dozens of worlds, but they were massively outnumbered by the combined populations of the council species. A war would be short, and it would be devastating, and humanity would lose. Captain Ryan Foster was given command of the evacuation fleet. It was the largest human operation in history, and it had to be completed in less than 1 year. Millions of people had to be moved from the colonies they had built, and the homes they had created, and the lives they had established on worlds light years from Earth. The colony on New Terra had farms that fed 3 systems. The research stations around Riverside were studying stellar phenomena that could revolutionize energy production. The settlement on Harvest Prime had children who had been born there and never seen Earth and did not understand why they had to leave the only home they had ever known. Lieutenant Amy Brooks stood on the observation deck of one of the transport ships and watched another load of refugees come aboard from Liberty Station. These were people who had spent decades building something, and now they were being forced to abandon it all because the galaxy was afraid of human potential. She said it was not right, and it was not fair. It was not just Ryan agreed with her, but fairness was not a factor in their current situation. The council had made its decision, and humanity did not have the power to change it. If they resisted, then the council would use force and people would die. The only choice was to comply and hope that someday things would be different. The last human vessel crossed back into the Sol system on the final day of the deadline. Admiral Helen Carter stood on the bridge of the Earth Defense Force flagship. Vanguard N watched as Council peacekeepers established a blockade at the edge of human space. Sensors showed dozens of ships from multiple species, all positioned to prevent any human vessel from leaving. The message was clear, and it was final. Humanity was confined to its home system, and the rest of the galaxy was off limits. Commander Peter Grant stood beside the Admiral and spoke quietly. He said they were home now, and maybe that was not the worst thing. Earth was still there, and the solar system had resources, and humanity could survive even without access to the wider galaxy. Helen looked at the blockade, and her expression was hard. She told Peter that they were not home because home implied safety and freedom. What they had now was a cage, and the council had just locked the door. The galaxy thought it had solved a problem by pushing humanity away, but what it had actually done was given humanity time. Time to think, and time to grow, and time to become something that the council would eventually regret creating. The blockade held, and the months turned into years. Earth adapted to isolation because humans had always been good at adapting. The colonies in the solar system expanded, and new habitats were built, and the population that had been spread across dozens of worlds was consolidated into one system. On the surface, it looked like humanity was accepting its fate, but beneath the surface, something else was happening. Scientists who had been restricted by council regulations were suddenly free to pursue any research they wanted. Engineers who had been told certain technologies were too dangerous began developing them anyway. Military planners who had designed weapons to council standards started thinking about what could be built if those standards no longer applied. 15 years would pass before the galaxy learned what happens when you corner a species as creative and stubborn as humanity. 15 years of isolation and development and preparation. The council thought they had eliminated a problem, but what they had actually done was create their worst nightmare. They had compelled the humans to leave, and soon they would face the consequences. 15 years passed in what humanity would later call the Great Silence, and during that time, the galaxy assumed that isolation had humbled the troublesome species from Earth. The Council believed that humans were learning their lesson and accepting their place, and eventually they might be civilized enough to rejoin galactic society on proper terms. The Council was completely wrong about all of it. Dr. Kevin Rhodes stood in an underground facility built deep beneath the Rocky Mountains and presented his work to a gathering of Earth's most important scientists and military leaders. The room was shielded from every known form of detection because what happened here could not be allowed to reach Council sensors. Kevin activated a holographic display that showed a ship design unlike anything the Council had ever imagined. The quantum displacement drive was the breakthrough that changed everything. Kevin explained that Council ships used jump points and hyperspace corridors that were predictable and detectable. Human ships would not need any of that, because the new drive let them phase through dimensions that Council mathematics said should not even exist. Their ships would not just be faster than anything the galaxy had seen before, but they would be completely invisible while traveling. Admiral Mulholland Carter leaned forward and asked to see a demonstration. Kevin played the test footage, and even the hardened military officers in the room went silent. A human ship simply vanished from normal space and reappeared thousands of kilometers away without leaving any trace that sensors could detect. The Council thought in terms of roads and highways, but humanity had just learned to ignore roads entirely. Dr. Christine Yang brought up the weapons development data, and the displays showed designs that were beautiful and terrible at the same time. 15 years of isolation had let human scientists explore every idea that the Council had declared too dangerous or too destabilizing. Plasma lances that burned hotter than stars and railguns that used magnetic acceleration to fire projectiles at speeds the Council said were impossible. Missile systems with artificial intelligence programs that could rewrite their own code thousands of times per second. Self-replicating nanite warheads that did not just destroy targets, but corrupted them and turned them into weapons. Against their own side, someone in the room asked if these weapons were legal under galactic conventions. Helen responded with a cold smile and reminded everyone that humanity was not part of the galactic community anymore. They did not answer to Council laws, or Council ethics, or Council limitations. The galaxy had pushed them out, so now humanity would develop whatever they needed to survive, while the military prepared for an eventual confrontation that everyone knew was coming. Civilian scientists pursued knowledge with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Professor Danny Martinez worked in a laboratory orbiting Neptune, far from any eyes that might be watching, and he had successfully created something that the Council had explicitly forbidden humans from researching. He had created a stable wormhole. Danny explained the difference to the Oversight Committee through quantum encrypted channels. Council jump gates connected fixed points in space and took years to build and could only link locations where both ends of the gate existed. Human wormholes could open anywhere at any time and required nothing on the other end. A ship could be at Earth and open a door to the other side of the galaxy and step through as easily as walking from one room to another. Senator Kate Williams sat on the Science Development Committee, and she understood exactly what this meant. This was why the Council had always told humanity that certain theories were too destabilizing to pursue. This was why they had restricted human research into dimensional physics. The Council had been afraid that humans would discover exactly what Danny had just discovered, and now that fear was completely justified. Danny nodded and said the Council had been right to be afraid because humanity had just made the entire galactic transportation infrastructure obsolete. Every jump gate, in every hyperspace corridor, in every carefully mapped route was now primitive technology compared to what humans could do throughout the solar system. Other projects flourished in ways they never could have under Council oversight. Genetic engineers who had been bound by Council bioethics regulations now pushed the boundaries of what human biology could become. They were not creating monsters or superweapons, but they were improving on what nature had provided. Humans who could survive in hard vacuum for short periods. neurological enhancements that made human reaction times faster than any species the Council had ever cataloged, cellular modifications that extended lifespan and eliminated most of the diseases that had plagued humanity since the beginning. Dr. Grace Palmer ran the genetic research station on Titan, and she observed that humanity was becoming something new. Not better than what they had been, but adapted to what they needed to be. The galaxy had forced humans into isolation, so humans had used that isolation to evolve. Commander Alex Wright ran the long-range monitoring network, and his job was to watch Council space from hidden sensor platforms scattered just beyond the blockade. For 15 years, he and his team had observed and recorded every ship movement and every communication they could intercept and every political development in the galaxy beyond. What they learned was extremely valuable. The Council was fracturing. Alex reported this during his quarterly briefing to military command. The unity that the Council had shown when expelling humanity had been artificial and temporary. Without humans as a common enemy, the old rivalries and disputes were surfacing again. The Krell and the Veluxians had nearly gone to war 3 years ago over a trade disagreement. The Thrain Collective was facing internal rebellion from younger members who questioned why the leadership was so afraid of change. Officer Megan Torres was the chief intelligence analyst, and she had even more interesting information. The economic data showed that removing human trade from the galactic economy had hurt the Council more than anyone had predicted. Human colonies had been major consumers of Council goods, and human scientists had been providing breakthrough research that other species had built entire industries around. Without that trade and without that innovation, the Council economy was stagnating. There was also a security problem that the Council had not anticipated. Pirate attacks on commercial shipping had increased dramatically in the outer sectors. Raiders were hitting remote colonies and stealing cargo shipments, and the Council peacekeepers were spread too thin to respond effectively. The reason for the thin coverage was obvious, because the Council had stationed a third of their entire military fleet watching the human blockade. They were watching a border where nothing appeared to be happening, and meanwhile, their own territory was becoming less secure. Helen absorbed all the intelligence with quiet satisfaction. The Council had thought that isolating humanity would weaken the troublesome species, but instead, the isolation had weakened the Council itself. Every ship watching the Sol system was a ship that could not patrol trade routes or respond to emergencies or maintain order in the far territories. What the Council did not know was that humanity had not been entirely idle on their side of the blockade. Small teams using the new stealth technology had been slipping past the Council sensors for years. They did not make contact with anyone, and they did not cause any incidents. But they explored, and they studied. And they prepared for the day when humanity would step back. Onto the galactic stage, Lieutenant Sam Cooper had led one of those missions. His ship was no larger than a civilian shuttle, but it was packed with technology that would make Council scientists weep. He had spent 6 months charting unexplored systems in the galactic east and mapping resources and identifying habitable worlds that no one had ever claimed. When he returned to Earth, he reported that there were hundreds of systems out there that the Council had never even surveyed. The resources were beyond measure, and no one was using them. Because the Council species had stopped exploring? Generations ago, Kevin observed that the Council species were old, and they had grown comfortable. They had their territories and their established trade routes, and they saw no reason to expand further. They were content with what they had and content to maintain the status quo. Forever, Helen said, that was the difference between humanity and the Council. The Council was content to stagnate while humanity had spent 15 years sharpening their claws. But weapons and technology alone would not be enough for what was coming. Humanity needed something else, and they needed people who understood what this conflict was really about. She found what she needed in the generation that had been born after the expulsion. These were young people who had grown up hearing stories about the galaxy beyond, but never seeing it. They had been taught from childhood that humanity had been wronged and that someday there would be a reckoning. They had trained their entire lives for the day when humanity would prove that expelling them had been the biggest mistake the Council ever made. Lieutenant Nicole Patterson was one of them. She had been born the year of the expulsion, and she had never met an alien or walked on a world outside the solar system or known anything except preparation for an eventual return. When Helen interviewed her for the final evaluation before accepting her into the expeditionary force, Nicole said that her entire generation was ready and they were just waiting for the word to be given. Helen looked at the young officer and saw determination that was both inspiring and frightening. She told Nicole that the word would be given soon because events beyond the blockade were moving in ways that would give humanity exactly the opportunity they had been preparing for. The galaxy was about to face a crisis that the Council could not handle alone. The elder species, with their ancient traditions and their outdated military doctrines and their refusal to innovate, would find themselves confronting a threat that required exactly the kind of creative thinking they had always feared. They would need help, and there was only one species capable of providing it. Helen knew that the Council would resist asking for help until the very last moment because their pride would not allow them to admit they needed the species they had expelled. But eventually desperation would overcome pride, and when that happened, humanity would be ready. Ready with ships the Council could not track, and weapons the Council could not counter, and soldiers who had spent their entire lives preparing for this moment. The great silence was ending, and the galaxy was about to learn what happens when you give a species like humanity 15 years of uninterrupted time to prepare. They had compelled the humans to leave, and now they were going to face the consequences of that decision. The distress signal came from the edge of Valorian territory on a day that had started like any other across Council space. A remote scientific outpost studying radiation patterns from a dying star sent out an emergency broadcast that reached the nearest Council station within minutes. The message was brief and panicked, and then it cut off with horrifying abruptness. The scientist on duty reported something coming through the quantum barrier at the edge of the galaxy. Unknown ships were appearing by the thousands, and they were not responding to any hails or communication attempts. They were not slowing down or changing course. They were simply destroying everything in their path and converting the debris into more of themselves. Then the transmission ended in static, and every attempt to re-establish contact failed. Within hours, the Council understood that something terrible had entered their galaxy. An extragalactic force that no one had ever encountered before was spreading through the eastern sectors like a plague. They were biological ships that absorbed matter and energy and used it to grow larger and create more vessels. They did not communicate or negotiate or show any interest in anything except consumption and expansion. The Council called them the Swarm, the human monitoring stations called them an opportunity. Commander Alex Wright watched the intelligence reports flood in through the hidden sensor network that humanity had maintained beyond the blockade for 15 years. The Swarm was spreading faster than the Council could respond, and their defenses were being overwhelmed at every engagement. Council peacekeepers had not faced a real military threat in centuries, and their tactics were outdated, and their crews were inexperienced, and their weapons were designed for show rather than actual. Combat Officer Megan Torres analyzed the encrypted Council communications that the human network was intercepting. She reported that panic was spreading through Council leadership as fast as the Swarm was spreading through their territory. Their military commanders were calling up reserve forces, but most of those vessels had not seen active duty in decades. The crews needed training, and the ships needed repairs, and the whole Council defense structure was revealing itself to be far weaker than anyone had realized. Admiral Helen Carter asked how long before the Swarm reached inhabited Council worlds. Megan calculated that at the current rate of advance, the bioships would hit the Thrain colonies in 3 weeks. The core Council systems would be under attack in 6 weeks. If the Swarm continued on its current trajectory and the Council could not stop it, then the leading edge would reach human space in approximately 4 months. Helen made her decision immediately. She ordered all scout teams recalled and began full mobilization of the human fleet. Someone needed to establish direct communication with the Council chambers, and they needed to do it. Now Commander Peter Grant warned that the council would not listen because their pride would not allow them to ask for help from the species they had expelled 15 years ago. Helen said they would not wait for the council to ask, because humanity was going to offer assistance whether the council wanted it or not. The message reached the council through communication channels that should not have existed. Ambassador Vexter stared at the holographic image of Admiral Helen. Carter in his shock was visible even through the translation of his alien features. He said it was impossible because the council blockade had been in place for 15 years and no human ship should have been able to get a signal through. Helen interrupted and told him the blockade was irrelevant. Humanity had been able to bypass it whenever they chose to, and they had simply chosen not to until now. She was not contacting the council to gloat about their security failures. She was contacting them to offer help against the swarm. Vexter asked if she was serious. He said that humanity had been expelled and isolated, and now they wanted to help defend the same council that had cast them out. Helen explained that her people had been monitoring the swarm since it first appeared. Human scientists had analyzed the bioships and identified their attack patterns and discovered weaknesses that the council had missed. Humanity had weapons and tactics that might actually stop the invasion. The Krell ambassador said that human arrogance knew no bounds. He asked how humanity could possibly defeat what the combined council forces could not handle. Helen responded with a simple question. How many worlds had the swarm consumed in the past week, and how many billions of council citizens were already dead? Vexter fell silent because the numbers were catastrophic. Entire colonies had been wiped out, and the death toll was climbing into numbers that the galaxy had not seen in thousands of years. The swarm was not slowing down, and every engagement showed that. Council weapons were barely effective against the Biodash ships. Helen asked what the council wanted in exchange for human assistance. Did they want humanity readmitted to the council, or perhaps territory or access to resources? Vexter suspected there had to be a price because no one offered help for free. Helen said the price was simple. She wanted the council to remember this moment. Remember that they needed humanity, and remember that they had been wrong to expel them. Remember that the next time they were tempted to punish a species for being different. But first the council needed to survive, because if the swarm won, there would be no council left to remember anything. The debate in council chambers was fierce and bitter. Many species refused to even consider accepting help from humans. Others, particularly those in the swarm's immediate path, were desperate enough to accept aid from anyone who offered it. The Valorian representative asked if humanity could be trusted and how the council could be sure this was not some elaborate scheme. A new voice answered that question. Captain Ryan Foster walked calmly into the council chambers with no guards and no weapons and no authorization. Every security system in the building screamed warnings, but none of them could identify exactly what they were detecting. Ryan introduced himself and said he was there to make things simple for the council. He told them they had two choices. They could maintain their pride and refuse human help and watch the swarm consume their worlds one by one until nothing was left but ash and bones. Or they could accept that they needed humanity and give humans the chance to prove that the species they had expelled was also the species that would save them. Counselor Thrain asked what would happen. After the swarm was defeated, would humanity demand concessions or territory, or political power in exchange for their assistance? Ryan smiled, but it was not a friendly expression. He said that after the swarm was defeated, the council would have bigger problems because the galaxy was going to see that the mighty council needed humans to survive. Every species would know that all the ancient wisdom and advanced technology of the elder races was not enough. People would question whether the council should be leading the galaxy at all. Vexter demanded to know if Ryan was threatening them. Ryan said he was stating facts. The galaxy was changing whether the council liked it or not. They could change with it, or they could become extinct. Right now, the swarm was making that choice for them in the most literal way possible. The vote was closer than it should have been, but desperation finally won over pride. The council accepted humanity's offer of assistance with the condition that human forces would operate under council command and would withdraw immediately after the threat was eliminated. When Helen heard those terms, she laughed because the Council still thought they were in charge of the situation. Commander Peter Grant asked if humanity would honor those terms. Helen said they would honor them exactly as much as they needed to. She ordered the First Fleet to deploy and said it was time to show the galaxy what humanity had been building for 15 years. The Council fleet gathered at a staging area 3 systems away from the swarm's advancing front. Hundreds of ships from dozens of species represented the combined military might of the galaxy's elder civilizations. Then the human ships arrived and everything changed. Admiral Carlos Rivera commanded the human First Fleet, which consisted of 50 vessels that did not match any design the Council had ever seen. Where Council ships were massive and heavily armored and built to absorb punishment, the human vessels were sleek and angular and clearly designed for speed and precision. They looked small compared to the Council dreadnoughts, but the power readings coming from them made no sense. Fleet Commander Zix, of the Thrain Collective, watched the human ships take their positions and remarked that they seemed barely larger than cruisers. His tactical officer reported that the sensors had to be malfunctioning because the energy signatures from those small ships were higher than anything that size should be able to generate. Every sensor was reading the same impossible data. Those human vessels were producing more power than Council ships 3 times their size. Carlos opened a channel to the Council flagship and reported that the human First Fleet was in position and ready for operations. He asked for orders from Commander Zix, but everyone who heard him could detect the tone that suggested he did not really expect to follow those orders. The battle plan was standard. Council doctrine: form a defensive line and absorb the initial swarm assault, and then counterattack with superior firepower. It was a strategy that had failed repeatedly for the past 3 weeks, but the Council commanders could not seem to imagine doing things differently. Darlos reviewed the plan and immediately began making his own decisions. He told Lieutenant Nicole Patterson that her squadron would hold in reserve, and when the Council line broke, they would move in to fill the gaps. Nicole asked what she should do if the Council ordered them to maintain formation. Carlos said she should experience a tragic communications failure at exactly the right moment. The swarm arrived, and it was like watching a living nightmare flow through space. Thousands of bioships moved together with perfect coordination like a school of predatory fish that shared a single mind. They did not maneuver like mechanical vessels. They anticipated each other and flowed around obstacles and converged on targets with terrible efficiency. The Council fleet opened fire at maximum range with every weapon they possessed. Energy beams that could crack moons and missile barrages that could destroy asteroids struck the leading edge of the swarm formation. The result was disappointing and terrifying at the same time. Some bioships absorbed the attacks, and their organic hulls seemed to drink in the energy. Others deflected the missiles with fields that appeared and disappeared faster than sensors could track. The few bioships that were actually destroyed were immediately replaced by others flowing up from the rear of the formation. Fleet Commander Zix watched his tactical displays with growing horror. He said the swarm was adapting to their weapons. Every shot that failed to kill a bioship seemed to make it stronger and more resistant to the next attack. His weapons officer confirmed that energy signatures were being analyzed and countered by the organic ships faster than the Council forces could adjust their targeting systems. The Council line began to buckle under the assault. Bioships flowed around strong points and concentrated on weak spots with the kind of tactical intelligence that should not have been possible for mindless organisms. Zix realized that the swarm was not mindless at all. It was incredibly intelligent, and it was learning from every second of combat. Admiral Burrell Rivera watched the Council line breaking and checked his tactical display. He had waited long enough, and now it was time to show the galaxy what human weapons could actually do. He gave the order for all human ships to engage with full weapons authorization and told his captains to execute attack pattern Delta. The human ships moved in a way that made Council observers think they were watching a completely different kind of warfare. They did not form a static line or hold defensive positions. They became a flowing mass of vessels that used every dimension of space and supported each other while maintaining perfect spacing. Each ship moved independently, but they worked together like parts of a single organism. The first human weapons to fire were the plasma lances that Dr. Christine Yang had designed 15 years ago. Superheated matter, contained in magnetic bottles, erupted from the human ships and struck the bioships with temperatures that made stars look cold by comparison. Where Council weapons had made the organic armor adapt and strengthen, the plasma lances simply vaporized everything they touched. There was no time for adaptation and no chance for survival. The bioships hit by plasma fire ceased to exist. Zix's tactical officer said it was impossible. Those temperatures should not be sustainable in normal space, and the energy required should have melted the weapons firing them. Carlos explained over the open channel that the plasma was contained in a dimensional pocket until the moment of impact. By the time the swarm sensors detected what was hitting them, it was already too late to adapt or defend. The railguns fired next, and they were even more devastating in their simplicity. Hypervelocity projectiles accelerated to a fraction of light speed, carried enough kinetic energy to punch through multiple bioships in a single shot. There was no energy signature to detect, and no warning before impact. Just raw physics delivered with surgical precision. Nicole. Patterson's squadron swept through a gap in the swarm formation and released their adaptive missiles. Each warhead contained an artificial intelligence program that could rewrite its own code thousands of times per second. The bioships tried to analyze and counter the missiles, but the targeting algorithms changed faster than organic systems could process. Every missile found its target, and every target died. The nanite warheads were the weapons that truly terrified everyone watching the battle. When they detonated, they released clouds of self-replicating machines that did not just destroy the bioships, but corrupted them. The nanites reprogrammed organic systems and turned bioships against their own kind. They created cascading failures that spread through the swarm network like a disease burning through a population with no immunity within. 30 minutes of engaging the human fleet had stopped the swarm advance completely. Zix stared at his displays and tried to comprehend what he was witnessing. 50 human ships had accomplished what hundreds of council vessels had failed to achieve in weeks of continuous combat. The swarm that had seemed unstoppable was now retreating and trying to regroup against an enemy it could not adapt to fast enough. Carlos announced that his forces were reforming their defensive positions. He recommended that council forces pull back damaged vessels and allow the human fleet to maintain the front line. Zix wanted to argue and wanted to maintain council authority, but he had just watched 50 human ships prove themselves more effective than his entire fleet. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. The battle raged for 3 days without stopping. The swarm kept sending wave after wave of bioships, trying to overwhelm the human defenses through sheer numbers. Carlos had studied military history from Earth's past, and he knew how to fight this kind of war. He did not hold a static defensive line. His ships rotated through combat positions and pulled back damaged vessels and brought up fresh forces. He maintained constant pressure that adapted to everything the swarm tried. Lieutenant Sam Cooper commanded the Stealth Reconnaissance Wing, and his ships were invisible to both swarm and council sensors. He traced the bioship formations back through multiple systems to find their source. After 2 days of careful tracking, he reported success. The swarm had a central hub ship that was coordinating the entire invasion. It was massive and located 3 systems behind the front lines, and it was controlling every bioship in the invasion force. Carlos smiled when he heard the report. He said it was time to cut off the head and watch the body die. The plan he proposed was dangerous to the point of insanity. A strike force would use the experimental wormhole technology to jump directly to the hub ship location and destroy it before the swarm could react. If the plan worked, the coordination network would collapse and the bioships would become vulnerable. If it failed, the strike force would be cut off and destroyed. Carlos announced he would lead the strike personally. Peter Grant warned that the council would never approve such a risky operation. They still believed they were in command, and they would not authorize an attack using untested technology. Carlos said they would not ask for approval and told his people to prepare the Pathfinder Squadron for immediate deployment. Word of the plan reached Ambassador Vexter, anyway. The Krell diplomat appeared on the communication channel and said the plan was complete madness. The wormhole technology had never been tested in combat, and the strike force could jump into a star, or into empty space, or directly into the heart of the swarm formation. Any of those outcomes would mean the loss of some of humanity's best ships and commanders. Carlos responded calmly. He said this was how humanity fought wars. They identified the critical objective and accepted the risks and executed the plan. The Council could either support them or stay out of their way. Vexter asked what would happen if the strike failed. Carlos said the Council would be no worse off than before humans arrived, but the strike would not fail. The Pathfinder Squadron consisted of 15 human vessels, equipped with experimental wormhole generators and enough firepower to make Council dreadnoughts look weak. Nicole Patterson commanded one ship, and Sam Cooper commanded another, and Lieutenant Amy Brooks commanded a third. Each of them had trained their entire lives for exactly this kind of mission. Nicole reported that coordinates were locked and wormhole generation would begin in 60 seconds. The fabric of space twisted in ways that violated every law of physics the Council understood. Reality fold. Ed and 15 human ships stepped through a door that should not have existed and emerged 3 light-years away, directly facing the swarm hub ship. The thing was monstrous beyond description. A bioship the size of a small moon pulsed with organic energy and trailed tendrils of living matter that connected to thousands of smaller vessels. It was the physical manifestation of the swarm coordination network, and it was the brain that controlled the entire invasion. Carlos gave the order to attack with everything they had. He said they would not get a second chance, and they needed to make this count. The human vessels unleashed concentrated fire that would have vaporized planets. Plasma lances burned into the hub ship's surface, and railgun projectiles punched through organic armor, and adaptive missiles burrowed deep before detonating. The nanite warheads were saved for last. And when they deployed, they infected the hub ship with corrupting programs that spread like wildfire. Through its systems, the swarm reacted, and bioships swarmed too. Protect their central intelligence. The human ships moved between them too fast to track and too unpredictable to pin down. Amy Brooks reported that the hub ship coordination signals were degrading rapidly. The swarm network was collapsing as the central intelligence died. Sam Cooper announced that wormhole generators were standing by for emergency extraction. They could pull out whenever Carlos gave the word. Carlos watched the hub ship dying and knew that 3 light-years away, the swarm forces at the front lines were falling into chaos as their unified intelligence fragmented. He said they would not leave yet, because they were going to finish this completely. The hub ship died in a cascade of biological failures. Its massive form literally consumed itself as the corrupted programming spread through every system. When the end came, it was almost too quick. One moment there was a living vessel controlling thousands of bioships across multiple star systems. The next moment, there was nothing but debris spreading through space. Carlos ordered immediate wormhole extraction for all ships. They stepped back through reality and emerged at the front lines to find the swarm in complete chaos. Without coordination, the bioships were attacking each other as often as they attacked Council forces. The organized invasion had become a panicked rout. Carlos transmitted to the Council fleet and told them to push forward. He said they should not stop until every bioship was destroyed, or driven back through the quantum barrier they had emerged from. The pursuit lasted another week, but the outcome was never in doubt. The swarm, broken and leaderless, fled back to whatever dark region of space had created them. The Council had won the war, but everyone knew who had actually delivered the victory. The victory celebration on the Council core world of Harmonia was the largest gathering in galactic history. Representatives from every member species crowded the great plaza to cheer the defeat of the swarm and honor the heroes who had saved the galaxy from extinction. The humans were conspicuously absent from the main celebration because they had been invited to a different kind of meeting. Admiral Helen Carter sat in a conference room deep within the Council chambers facing Ambassador Vexter and a dozen other Council leaders. The atmosphere was tense despite the recent victory because everyone in the room knew this conversation would determine the future of galactic politics. Vexter began with formal words of gratitude and acknowledged that humanity's intervention had been decisive in defeating the swarm threat. Helen waited for what she knew was coming next. Vexler said the council was grateful, but the original terms of expulsion remained in effect. Humanity had agreed to withdraw their forces after the threat was neutralized, and that time had now come. The Krell ambassador spoke carefully and chose his words with diplomatic precision, but the message was clear. The council wanted humans to go back to their isolation. Helen leaned back in her chair and studied the council representatives with an expression that made several of them visibly uncomfortable. Around her neck she wore a small pendant that looked like simple jewelry, but every human in the room knew. It was actually a quantum communicator linked directly to the entire human fleet. She spoke a single word in response to Vexler's statement. No. The silence that followed was profound and heavy. Counselor Thrain demanded to know if Helen was refusing a direct order from the council. He said they had granted humanity the privilege of assisting in the defense of the galaxy, and that did not give humans the right to make demands or ignore agreements. Helen stood and walked to the window that looked out over the celebrating crowds below. She said the council was correct about one thing. 15 years ago, they had expelled humanity based on fear. Fear that humans were too different and too dangerous and too disruptive to the established order. She turned to face the council leaders and told them they had been right to be afraid. She explained that while the council celebrated their traditions and maintained their stable hierarchies, humanity had spent 15 years advancing. They developed technology the council said was impossible, and pursued research the council had declared forbidden. They became exactly what the council had feared they might become. Then they used all of that to save the galaxy. Vexler argued that this proved the council's point. Humans were dangerous and unpredictable, and they showed no hesitation in developing weapons of terrible power. Helen agreed, and said they had developed those weapons because the council left them no choice. The council had isolated humanity and threatened them and told them they were unwelcome. Did the council really think humans would just sit quietly and accept that fate? Helen laid out what was going to happen next. Humanity was not withdrawing, and they were not going back to their solar system. And they were not accepting isolation ever again. Humans would stay in the galaxy and continue exploring and expanding and researching whatever they wanted. The council could accept that reality, or they could try to enforce the old expulsion order. Thrain called it an outrage and demanded to know if Helen was threatening the council. Helen said she was stating facts. The council fleets were damaged and their economies were strained and their people were exhausted from the war. They could not afford another conflict, especially against an enemy they now knew possessed weapons they could not. COUNTERA Valorian representative asked if humanity would actually go to war with the council after helping to save them. Helen said she hoped it would not come to that, but the age of the council's absolute authority was over. The galaxy had changed whether they wanted to accept it or not. Every species had watched the mighty council fail to stop the swarm, and then watched humanity succeed where the council had failed. People would question whether the council should be leading the galaxy at all. Vexler's mandibles clicked slowly as he processed what was happening. He asked if humanity demanded readmission to the council with full voting rights and official recognition. Helen said humanity demanded nothing because they did not need council permission to exist. They did not need seats in council chambers to have influence. The galaxy would listen to humanity whether the council granted them official status or not. Thrain asked what humans actually wanted, if not political power or territory. Helen walked back to her seat and met the eyes of each council leader in turn. She said she wanted them to remember this moment. Remember that the species they feared and expelled became the species that saved them. Remember that their attempt to isolate and contain humanity had failed completely. Remember that the next time they were tempted to punish someone for being different, she told them the galaxy was changing and new species would emerge and new technologies would be discovered, and new challenges would arise. The council could either adapt to that change, or they could cling to their traditions and watch the universe leave them behind. Humanity had made their choice, and now the council needed to make theirs. Helen left the council chambers and walked to the human delegation ship. Inside, Admiral Carlos Rivera and Captain Ryan Foster were waiting with the rest of the command staff. Carlos asked how the meeting had gone. Helen said it went exactly as expected because the council was terrified and angry and completely unable to do anything about the situation. Ryan asked if the council would try something desperate. Helen said they probably would, but it would not matter because the galaxy had already changed. She brought up a holographic display showing the current distribution of human forces. While the council had been focused on the swarm, human ships had quietly established presence in dozens of systems throughout the galaxy. Lieutenant Nicole Patterson reported that 17 species outside the council had made contact with human representatives. Most of them were eager to establish trade relationships and exchange technology. The council's monopoly on galactic commerce was effectively broken, and there was nothing they could do to restore it. Dr. Kevin Rhodes appeared via quantum communication from his laboratory ship. He reported that the wormhole network was expanding faster than projected. Within a month, humanity would have instant travel and communication between any human facility in the galaxy. Every council jump gate and hyperspace route has become obsolete technology compared to what humans could offer. Helen reviewed the reports with satisfaction. Humanity was not conquering the galaxy through force. They were making themselves essential to it. Every species that traded with humans or used human technology or relied on human protection became a voice arguing against any attempt to isolate humanity again. 6 months passed, and the galaxy settled into a new reality. The council still met and debated and passed resolutions, but their actual authority had diminished significantly. Species that once deferred automatically to council leadership now looked to humanity for innovation and protection and trade opportunities. Vexter requested a private meeting with Helen on a neutral space station, far from official channels. When they met, the Krell ambassador spoke without diplomatic pretense. He said humanity had won, and they were now the dominant power in the galaxy. Whether the council officially acknowledged it or not, Helen corrected him gently. She said humanity was a dominant power, but not the only one, and that was an important distinction. Humans did not want to replace the council or rule the galaxy alone. They wanted to explore and learn and push boundaries. If that resulted in others looking to them for leadership, then so be it. But it was not their primary goal. Vexter asked if Helen truly meant that. Humanity could destroy the council whenever they chose. Their technology and weapons and unified purpose gave them that power. Helen acknowledged it was true, but asked what the point would be. The galaxy needed multiple perspectives and different approaches and various species working together. A human-only galactic order would become just as stagnant as the council-only order had been, she told Vexter that humanity wanted the council to survive and adapt and become better. They wanted the elder species to stop fearing change and start embracing it. They wanted a galaxy where species were judged by their actions rather than by how well they conformed to ancient traditions. Vex. Thor said there was a faction within the council that wanted to formally apologize for the expulsion and offer humanity full membership with complete rights and privileges. Helen asked about the others. Vexter admitted that many council members were still hoping the old order would somehow reassert itself. Helen smiled and said those council members were wasting their time. The galaxy had moved forward, and the only question was whether they would move with it. She told Vexter that humanity would accept an apology and consider council membership, but only on human terms. The days of the council dictating conditions were over. Years continued to pass, and humanity expanded throughout the galaxy. They established colonies on worlds the council had never surveyed and made discoveries that reshaped scientific understanding and built relationships with species that had been ignored under the old order. Slowly and reluctantly, but inevitably, the council changed. New species were admitted with fewer restrictions and research into previously forbidden fields was cautiously approved, and the rigid hierarchies began to soften. Admiral Helen Carter gave her final address to the unified Earth government. On the 50th anniversary of the expulsion, she was elderly now, but her mind remained sharp, and her voice carried the weight of 5 decades of experience. She told the assembled representatives that the council had thought they were punishing humanity by forcing them into isolation. They believed that cutting humans off from the galaxy would humble them and teach them their place. Instead, the isolation had given humanity the freedom to become something greater than they could have been under council. Restrictions, Helen said humanity, had proved that being expelled did not mean being defeated. Sometimes it meant being given the opportunity to chart your own course without interference. The council had pushed them out of their galaxy, so humans came back and changed it. Not through conquest or force, but through excellence and innovation in making themselves indispensable, she said. The council learned a lesson that should have been obvious from the beginning. You cannot stop change by expelling those who embody it. You can only delay the inevitable, and when change finally comes, it arrives with the force of all those wasted years behind it. Helen looked out at the representatives of humanity's colonies and stations spread across the galaxy. She said the council had compelled humans to leave, and now they faced the consequences. A galaxy where humanity was not just one voice among many, but the voice that others listened to most carefully. A galaxy that was more vibrant and dynamic and alive than the one had been expelled from. She told them that was not a consequence to regret. That was a consequence to celebrate, because humanity had turned exile into triumph and isolation into opportunity. They had proved that no one could cage the human spirit and no one could limit human potential. The galaxy had tried to push them aside, and instead humanity had reshaped the entire galactic order. The assembly rose in thunderous applause. Outside, human ships traveled freely throughout the galaxy with no blockades or borders to constrain them. On 1,000 worlds, humans worked alongside dozens of alien species, building a future that neither humanity nor the council could have imagined 50 years before. The galaxy had learned its lesson. You do not solve problems by pushing them away. You solve them by engagement and adaptation and willingness to change. The council had compelled the humans to leave, and in doing so, they ensured that when humanity returned, the galaxy would never be the same again.